Flanked by the great land masses of Asia and Africa lies the ancient kingdom of Persia. At the turn of the century,
Trump said he does not want war with Iran.
In the latest Iranian-backed attacks on Americans, there have now been 5 attacks.
What really went wrong between the US and Iran? This is a question that has confounded many and shaped the course of history in the Middle East. To understand the complex relationship between the United States and Iran, let's start with a bit of history. In the 1950s, the US was really worried about communism, and the Soviet Union was their main rival in the Cold War. At the same time, Iran had a big problem with its oil. What was the problem, you ask? There was a British oil company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now known as British Petroleum, BP. This company was making a lot of money by processing Iran's oil. In 1951, Iranians elected a leader named Mohammad Mossadegh. He promised to fix the situation with these foreign-owned oil companies. The Iranian government, which was similar in style to the UK's government, thought more of the money from processing Iran's oil should go to the Iranian people. But the British oil company didn't like that idea at all. So, the Iranian government decided to take matters into their own hands and took over BP's refineries in a place called Abadan. Now, across the ocean in the UK, there was a lot of anger about this, especially from the Home Secretary. But the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, wasn't too upset. In the US, people weren't paying much attention to this issue at the time. Later in 1951, Winston Churchill became the UK's Prime Minister. He wasn't happy about Iran taking over a British company's assets. He thought it made Britain look bad, but Churchill didn't want to handle this alone. To get control of Iranian oil back, they would need to change the entire Iranian government, and that wasn't a one-person job. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. The UK told the US State Department and the CIA that Iran's Communist Party, known as Tudeh, was becoming very popular, about 20% support, and might take over the country. This was a problem because Iran was getting friendly with the US, and it sat right next to the Soviet Union. If Iran turned communist, it could become Soviet territory. It's important to know that Mossadegh didn't like the Soviet Union. He knew they wanted ports on the Indian Ocean, and he didn't want Iran to become part of the Soviet Union. But the US was worried about the Cold War, and since Britain was an ally, they agreed to help. So the United States and the United Kingdom decided to plan and carry out a coup d'etat. They overthrew Iran's elected government and brought back the last Shah King of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, all with the blessings of Dwight Eisenhower, the US President, and Winston Churchill. Much of the plotting took place in the US Embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital. The coup happened in 1953, although it faced some challenges. The Shah was back in control, and it was a win-win for the UK and US oil interests. However, the Shah's popularity started to decline over the next 25 years. He didn't have the support of Iran's Islamic religious leaders, and he couldn't change that. The Shah tried to redistribute land to help the poor, but it didn't work as intended. It didn't really help the poor, and it made the Shah even less popular. He also created a secret police force called SAVAK, trained by American and Israeli military experts, and they weren't known for being gentle. They kidnapped and tortured thousands of people who criticized the government, especially religious groups. It was a brutal secret police force, and it made people associate the word Western with the Shah's regime. In 1979, things came to a head with the Iranian Revolution. Conditions in Iran weren't dramatically worse that year, and there were no major triggers for a revolution like losing a war. Iranians were just fed up with the Shah, so they kicked him out. The Shah went to Egypt, and there were worries that he and President Jimmy Carter might try to take back Iran. But the Shah was old, sick with cancer, and needed medical care. And guess who offered to help? That's right, the United States. Now remember, about 25 years earlier, the US had helped overthrow a popular government to create a dictatorship under the Shah. When Iranians saw the US taking in the Shah, they were afraid history would repeat itself. They stormed the US Embassy, which was the headquarters for planning the previous coup. This event led to the 444-day Iranian hostage crisis and created a serious rift in US-Iran relations. As things settled down, Iran faced a major challenge in the 1980s when Iraq attacked them. One big reason the war dragged on and became very costly was that the United States supported Iraq by giving them weapons and military resources. It's interesting to note that during this time, Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq. Yes, the same guy the US had given weapons and military equipment to. Ironically, in the following decades, the United States would end up in not one, but two conflicts with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. US-Iran relations remained tense for about 25 years. Iran wanted to rebuild after the Iraq War, while the United States was busy with its own wars in Iraq. Diplomatic relations have never really gone back to normal since 1979. Some people might recall that Iran was famously labeled part of George W. Bush's axis of evil. Because Iran had superpower military bases all around it, they started developing nuclear weapons. They thought having nuclear weapons was the only way to stop the United States from interfering in their politics, as the US had done before. In 2015, the United States, along with other countries like the United Kingdom, Russia, Germany, China, France, and the European Union, made a deal with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, to deal with Iran's nuclear weapons program. The deal was complicated, but the main idea was that Iran would stop working on nuclear weapons, let international inspectors check, and in return, the US and its friends would ease up on sanctions against Iran. The deal wasn't perfect, and it raised concerns about Iran restarting its nuclear weapons program later. But it was the first time in over 30 years that Iran and Western countries agreed on something. From 2015 until the US left the deal, international inspectors confirmed that Iran was following the rules. Then Donald J. Trump came into the picture. He wanted to undo what the previous president had done, so he decided to leave the JCPOA in 2018, and he brought back the old sanctions against Iran. This was surprising because the earlier sanctions were put in place because Iran was making nuclear weapons, and most of the world didn't want that. But the new sanctions seemed to be more about punishment than anything else, because international inspectors confirmed Iran was following the rules. This move disappointed the other countries that had signed the deal. Since then, things have only gotten worse. Iran started working on nuclear stuff again, breaking the rules of the JCPOA. After the US killed an Iranian military leader named Soleimani, Iran seems to think the deal is completely dead. With recent attacks on a US base in Iraq, it looks like this cycle of tension will keep going. So after all this history, what has the United States gained from its foreign policy towards Iran? Some say it's about 15 years of access to cheap oil from 1953 to 1979. Do you think it was worth it? In 1950, Iran was a democratic republic that strongly opposed the Soviet Union, although it had its problems. It was an opportunity for the United States to support and strengthen Iranian democracy and help their economy grow. Iran's strategic position could have made it a valuable ally during the Cold War, but history took a different turn.